Okay, and now we're recording, just letting everybody know. So I want to thank everyone for taking the time out of your evening to be here. And I also want to thank all the folks who put their time and energy towards teaching this class tonight. So this evening, we're joined by Hagerty Consulting. And from that consulting firm, we're joined by Christy Skevington and Marin Grunett. And for the second part of the class, Jensen from Sisterland Farms will be presenting. And for those unable to attend the whole class or who want to review what they learned tonight, a recording will be posted after the class. So a little bit about me. My name is Claire Menard, and I'm with WSU Kitsap and Regional Small Farms. My title is the New and Beginning Farmer Education Coordinator, and what that means is I bring educational classes like this one to Kitsap, Jefferson, and Clallam counties. But since this class is online, it's accessible and applicable to egg producers in other counties as well. And then this is the second class in a series about grant writing. If you missed the first one, I'll put a link to the video in a post-class email so you can catch that one. So farmers are often asking us for assistance with grant application and writing. And as you probably all know, it can be a confusing and complicated process. And though we cover a lot in these classes, not every issue can be anticipated or addressed. So I've sent a resource list to all of you, and in that list are local folks who can assist you in every step of the process. And these include people that have written many grants and been on grant review committees. If you live outside the Olympic and Kitsap Peninsulas, there are some statewide providers on that resource list, or you can reach out to your local extension or conservation district. And also, as you'll learn tonight, the folks at Hagerty Consulting, part of their work is helping producers like you write and apply for grants. So first off, we have Hagerty Consulting presenting. So they're here in conjunction with the Federal Funds Grant Writing Assistant Program. This program is an initiative of the Washington State Department of Commerce in partnership with Hagerty Consulting to support access to federal funds grant writing assistance for communities, producers, individuals across the state. And what you learn in this class is applicable to applying for federal grants like REAP or the Value Added Producers Grant. But I think you'll see that a lot of the information at grant writing will be applicable to non-federal grants as well. Anyways, I am now going to pass it off to Hagerty Consulting. Thanks so much.
And I'll just say while Marin is pulling up the slides, Claire, thank you for such a warm welcome, and thank you everyone for being here. We'll talk a little bit more about our services and kind of walk you through some different aspects of the grant application process. I think we are going to be interested in kind of focusing on the grant narrative and some of the actual writing components of the grant application. So we'll start off by doing kind of a brief presentation. We'll kind of talk through some different aspects of this terminology that gets used a lot in federal grant writing exercises. And then we'll actually try to do a mini grant writing exercise where we'll try to take some time and just have you write out a couple thoughts, do like a free write on what could potentially become a grant writing, a grant, material for a grant application. So, Marin, if your slides are up, I will pass it to you to introduce the program and start us through the presentation.
Everyone, my name is Marin Granette, and I am the program coordinator for the Federal Funds Grant Writing Assistance Program. And outside of the program, I'm also a farmer myself in Minnesota, so I do have some experience with these grants as well, and I'm excited to talk to you all about it. So the
And I
federal
realize,
funds, yes.
sorry, Marin, I realize I didn't introduce myself. I am Christy
Oh, yeah.
Skevington. I'm the manager of this project. And while I am not a farmer myself, I am married to one. So Marin and I were very excited to put this together and just think about this room and where we could help and support using our skills to kind of intersect with farming and the farming world. So thank you for having us here. And please, Marin, sorry to jump in.
No worries. I'm sorry, I forgot to give you space to introduce yourself. So the Federal Funds Grant Writing Assistance Program, Claire started to give a really good explanation of it. We are through the Department of Commerce and funded actually through the Climate Commitment Act, which is really exciting because we're able to help organizations throughout the state of Washington apply for federal funding specifically to meet Washington's greenhouse gas emissions reduction goals and increase climate resilience. And local food is a big part of that. So we're excited to be able to support a lot of producers, and we're able to support a bunch of different types of participants throughout the state. So that could be tribes, local governments, nonprofits, small businesses, and that includes sole proprietorships, LLCs, S corps, any potentially type of small business that you may be. And we really try to focus and prioritize vulnerable populations in overburdened communities in who we're providing services to. Everybody is eligible if you fall into one of the participant types on the right, but we do try to focus specifically on those populations as well as people who are applying to federal funds for the first time, maybe are in an area that has been underrepresented in receiving federal funding in the past, or are in a tribal or rural area as well. And so for our workshop tonight, we're going to be using an actual open opportunity to ground the work that we're going to be talking about today. And so that is going to be the United States Department of Agriculture's Value Added Producer Grant, which is currently open right now. And the Value Added Producer Grant is specifically for agricultural producers. This could also mean a cooperative or a business majority owned by producers as well, but it is really focused on getting more money for the people who are producing the product in different ways. And it has two different types of grants within the Value Added Producer Grant. So you can apply for a planning grant or a working capital grant. And the biggest, I would say, hurdle to this grant for a lot of people may be the match requirement. It does require a 100% match. However, this is a really flexible program, so you can use all types of match. You can use loans, other grants, you can use your own labor, some of your own inventory as well. So you can be really creative there. And the application deadline is April 17th. Before I move forward, I just want to ask if everybody could put in the chat if you know about this grant opportunity, if you maybe applied for it before, or if you have heard about it. I would love to know everybody's familiarity with the grant. Cool. Yeah, don't know. So I'll go a little bit more in detail then. So what is a value-added product in this context? Value-added is one of those loosey-goosey words in agriculture that can mean a lot of different things. So with this grant in particular, it is a very broad definition. Like you can really apply for anything that would potentially increase the value of the product. So the way USDA defines that here is with these 5 different categories. So that can be the typical change in physical state, which is creating a new product out of your produce, like making strawberry jam or wool yarn or something that is entirely new. It can also be producing the product in a manner that makes it of greater value to the consumer. So this could be getting a certification such as organic or certified humane, or potentially transitioning to other types of practices that would be able to get a higher price for the same product. Additionally, you can physically segregate the product in a manner that results in the enhancement of the value, which sounds super technical, but it's actually a pretty simple concept. It's something like creating individual packaged portions of a product potentially, or maybe instead of selling a bunch of individual products, you put them together and sell it as like a meal kit or something like that. Like some way of sorting the product so that it will be more valuable to the consumer. And then the next one, farm or ranch-based renewable energy. Because this grant does focus specifically on agricultural products, this unfortunately does not mean solar panels or wind turbines. It is specifically talking about biofuels made from agricultural products. So if you're interested in biofuels and getting into that market, this could be a good opportunity. But you couldn't buy electricity, essentially. And then this last category is really a catch-all that I think a lot of people could potentially be eligible for. It is aggregating and marketing the product as a locally produced agricultural food product. All of these other categories don't necessarily have a prescribed market. You could be doing any of these things and shipping it across the country. However, for this one, it is about the market itself rather than doing something to the product. It is selling within a local area and really putting that forward as a way to add value by marketing it as a local product. And so what types of projects could be funded in this way? So like I mentioned, there are two different types of grants within this program. There's planning grants and working capital grants. And those planning grants really are anything that you would need to put together to kind of explore an option to do a value-added product. So this can be feasibility studies, business plans, marketing plans, anything that you would need a little time to put together and really lay out a plan. It's exactly what it sounds like. But then the working capital grants would be how you implement that plan. And so this would be things like buying processing equipment or doing the cost of sending it to a processor, marketing, advertising. This could be both like paying the fees to do different types of marketing as well as the specific materials if you want new packaging, for example. And you can also cover some of your own salary or consultant salary or inventory. That cannot be the full extent of the grant, but that can be part of it as well. And so there's a lot of creativity here to kind of work with these two different types of categories. I would note that the working capital grant application does require having a feasibility study. So if you do not have a feasibility study yet, that might be something that you would want to apply for the planning activity grant, and then potentially in a future year, you could go and apply for the working capital. And so for this application, if you're interested in it, you're going to have to register with a few different services. So like all federal awards, you will need to register with SAM.gov and get assigned a UEI number for your business or nonprofit. But specifically for the value-added producer grant, you will also need to register with the USDA e-authorization service. And for this grant, you will need to put in enough information to get the level 2 access, which if you're interested in pursuing this, that is something we could assist with and kind of explain what all that means. And you'll also need to log into the USDA's specific grant award portal for the value added producer grant. It's a little confusing because the acronym is GAP, but they do not mean good agricultural practices. In this context, it is the grant award portal, which you will need to log into to submit the grant. And that's something that you should log into before the day the grant is due. So before we move into the process of how we would apply for this grant and write a narrative, does anybody have any questions about the value added producer grant?
I will also be interested if there's anyone who wants to put in the chat that they're interested in pursuing an application. If this sounds interesting to them, that's also helpful to know as well.
Yeah, and feel free to come off mute too if you feel more comfortable with that. Very interested, worried about the funding freeze. Yeah. Mm-hmm. We have been in contact with the Washington State USDA representative on this program, and she did say that the program is still open. There's no anticipated changes to it, but you never know right now. But we do have confirmation from the grant officer that at least for now, things are going as usual.
I'll also just now add to, because I think that question will come up, and we were sort of anticipating that there are a lot of changes. So we'll speak to our experience. You know, we are still here. We are continuing to work with a lot of participants. There are a lot of changes happening with federal funds right now. It just is what it is, and we're watching it, we're tracking it, we're monitoring it. I will say that we are continuing to submit federal grant applications. We have been in contact with a lot of different grants officers, a lot of different funding streams. We have to be a little bit more strategic, a little bit more selective about what we're pursuing, what is still available. But we continue to see a lot of activity. We are continuing to work with participants around this. So I would say too, if you're sort of questioning, is there funding available? Is that something I even want to pursue right now? we can help answer those questions too. A lot of what Marin does, a lot of what we do is we have kind of program intake sessions. We'll meet with you, hear about your priorities. We'll scan and do a lot of the searching to see what federal funding might be available, and we'll also help monitor those changes. So if something does get pulled down, or just as often what we're seeing is it gets pulled down, it gets put back up. The wording is a little bit different, but the substance of what was there is still the same, and so a lot of was eligible before is still eligible now. It's just kind of a reframing of certain things to align with the new administration. It's out there, so I don't want to take too rosy a view on this, but I want to say that that is a big part of the work that we do, is kind of work with you on an individual basis and say, okay, what's available. So just to kind of put that out there, if there's interest but uncertainty, reach out to us anyway. We can see what we can do.
Yeah, and I would add, I saw some concern in the chat about the attacks on DEI and things like that, and that is a very real thing that we're dealing with. But we have a lot of creative grant writers who have been taking applications that really focused on telling the stories of underrepresented and overburdened communities and turning them around when the new administration came in and changed the things. And we have those skills to be able to tell your story in a different way that may be more amenable to the new changes in the government. So I definitely reach out to us, and we're here to kind of take some of the stress off and make the process of applying to federal funds a lot easier. So if you're worried about investing the time in a grant application, like with and maybe it not getting funded because you're qualify under some of the DAI categories, we can take that stress and we can kind of work on doing the time investment into the application and support you.
I'll respond to one more question I see here, and then maybe we can kind of talk about the application process. And I'll also add, if you, as questions come up, feel free to put them in the chat. We'll try to answer them all by the end of this. But, as you're thinking about it, feel free to add it, even if we've moved on from a different, to a different part of the conversation or presentation. But I do see a question about the steps to getting a UEI number. That's also something that we can work with you on. We also work with organizations, participants that have never received federal awards before, unfamiliar with the SAM.gov registration process. So we are focusing today kind of more on the narrative and the actual writing of the application, but we can also support kind of getting you set up to receive federal awards. So reach out to us for that too. We can give more information. We'll
Great.
continue
So
and then.
I'll pass it to Christy to do the narrative section.
Okay. All right. So before we get into the narrative writing, there's a lot of narrative preparation that can be very helpful. So we obviously there's many different ways to prepare for writing an application, but we kind of took some of the three big ones that we thought were most important just to get yourself into the right frame of mind. One of them is, of course, to read the NOFO. NOFO stands for Notice of Funding Opportunity, and it's basically the application. It will list all of the requirements. It tells you the purpose of the program, all of the different like federal rules and regulations that you might be responsible for if you apply for that funding. But it's helpful to really review it, and we call out a specific section because we are talking about the narrative component of this today, but it's the evaluation criteria. Every NOFO will have a section for evaluation criteria. And that's what the reviewers, they'll tell you very transparently, this is what the reviewers will use to rate and score your application, particularly when it's competitive. So reviewing this criteria first is always really helpful because it helps align what you're about to write directly to the purpose of the funding. And it's a competitive process to kind of do that and think about that. So read the NOFO, really internalize the evaluation criteria up front, and that's going to tell you kind of what you need, how to set yourself up to kind of gather the information that you need. Second is scan for previous winners. So I think this is a very overlooked and underrated competitive edge. A lot of federal awards, especially programs that have been around for years, will go and publish the narrative sections of previous winners or previous years. And so it's a smart move if you've got a little bit of time to kind of sit through and see, okay, what has been awarded before? There's lots of language in there, there's lots of projects in there. You can see kind of where the funders' preferences have been in the past, and that can set you up to think strategically about what projects of yours are going to be most competitive. And then the third one is gather data. So, what facts and data about your community or business will tell a compelling story about your project? We're going to talk about this a little bit in a few different slides, but the difference between what type of business data, what type of internal data, organizational data might you want to have on hand to kind of demonstrate that you have the capacity and the skills and the experience to get this funding, but then also what type of public facing, maybe community facing data might be helpful? What demographics? Who are you supporting? Who purchases your products? Who helps sell those products? Who buys? There's a lot of different ways to think about publicly available information that's also going to help tell a compelling story. Next slide, please, Naren. So these are key elements of a notice of funding opportunity, the NOFO I was referring to. So it's always a long document. It always has a table of contents. I don't know, if anyone wants to put in the chat kind of their experience with navigating federal funds before, that's also helpful to know how many people are familiar with NOFOs, the process of reading them. We do know that it can be quite lengthy. It can be a little bit challenging. There's just like pages and pages of information, but some of the core sections that you always want to look for and that are always the most helpful. One is the project program description. It outlines the purpose, the goals, and the objectives of the funding opportunity. So it gives you kind of a high level overview of what the intent of this funding is. The award information is really helpful. It tells you which federal agency is offering it. So not every federal agency is going to be releasing NOFOs that may be relevant to you. For this group, I would imagine that, there's very I hate to speak in absolutes, but I imagine that like the Health Resources Services Administration, like HRSA grants, might be less relevant than the US Department of Agriculture. So, looking at who the federal funding agency is always just a helpful starting point. It'll tell you the program number, the title number. It just gives you a lot of information that can help you track that resource. Eligibility information, I think this is probably one of the most critical ones. It's also sometimes one of the hardest to read and navigate, but it tells you which applicants are actually eligible for this funding. So I know one of the challenges of federal awards is you see this great program, it looks perfect, it's the right fit, and then you look at who's eligible and it's only eligible to a very certain small applicant type. Maybe it's only institutions of higher education, and it excludes a lot of other applicant types. So that's always one of the first ones that you want to look at as well. There's application and submission information. I think this is really helpful too because it tells you the deadlines, submission timelines, any application requirements. It gets into the nitty gritty of there's the narrative, which is what we're focusing on today, but then a lot of times these proposals will ask for really detailed, we want resumes of all your key staff. There's just like a lot of documentation that they're going to ask for. Business models, operation expenses, like just, all of the various forms that you might have to fill out. So it's helpful to kind of scan that and just know what you're getting into. The application review information, this is the evaluation criteria that we were talking about on the earlier slide. You always want to look for this because this is going to tell you how the application will be evaluated, how the awards will be selected. So if you know where to look, it tells you everything that you need to know. It's one of the more transparent processes because everything is very public facing, and it'll tell you exactly how you'll be scored. It'll tell you what will get the most points, what will get the least, what's most important to the reviewer and what's least important. But sometimes it can be hard to find. So, and then the last one is the award administration information. So this will tell you not just what you need in order to apply for the funding, but also the requirements, the compliance requirements, the auditing requirements, any reporting requirements that you'll need to take into account if you get the award and you're going to administer it. So I'd say this is the one where we end up helping out a lot in our program because there's a lot of funding out there. But then sometimes when you really look at the opportunity, you might say, you know what, the amount of work that this is going to take for me to implement this program as compared to the amount of money that I'm actually going to get out of this honestly, it might not be worth it. It might be challenging. So a lot of the times what we end up doing is just helping people kind of figure out, is this really funding that you want to go after? We're not always trying to tell you like all federal awards are great, all federal awards are worth going after. You really have to think about where you're at in your process, where you're at in your capacity, and can you take on kind of the requirements of that. So it's a good thing to look at this. It's a good thing to go in very clear-eyed into these opportunities, and that's something that we're also available to help navigate. Next slide, please, Lauren. So we pulled, I can imagine that this might be a little bit squinty to see, but we wanted to put a slide in here of what an actual NOFO kind of looks like. Like I said, these documents can be 30 pages long. This is a table of contents. You'll have this slide. We're going to send this out to you afterwards just so you can see it, but we just kind of boxed where some of those relevant information is, where you can see it in a table of contents. They'll tell you exactly where it is, what page to go locate it. So we just wanted you to have a real-time image. We used the Value Added Producers Grant NOFO as an example, but just wanted you to be able to see kind of what this looks like to try to track that information down when you go looking for it. And then I'm going to pass this back to Maren to talk about the evaluation criteria that we kind of lifted from this grant, so you get a sense of what that evaluation criteria might look like as well.
Yeah, so for the value added producer grant, there is a point system. There is 100 total points that can be possibly awarded to your application. To be considered eligible, you need to secure at least 50 points, but looking at the breakdown, that's not too difficult to do. The biggest section is the nature of the proposed venture. And this section has a bunch of different subsections that aren't included on this slide, but it's mostly about showing that your plan is well thought out and you have data backing up that you can do it and there will be a market for it and you have like feasibility studies and things like that for a potential working capital grant. For a planning grant, there's a little bit less requirements in that section, but it's mostly about just selling your idea. And then the qualifications of key personnel section is where you are kind of selling yourself and whoever else is on your team and showing that you can do this work. And the language is applications that demonstrate key personnel with strong credentials. And I think this can sound a little bit intimidating, but you do not need to have like a PhD or a bunch of certifications to be considered having strong credentials. If you say, I have 5 years experience farming and this is all the things I've done, and you can really sell that in your writing, you can really come across as having strong credentials. So I wouldn't be put back by that. And then another really big section of points is the work plan and budget. And this is just really showing that you did your homework and you know how much things are actually going to cost and you're able to cite it and show that you thought through how this is going to happen. And then the other sections are all things that are not necessarily under your control. I think the matching funds commitment is you can get really creative there. You just have to show that you are able to provide that 100% match of the amount of money you're asking for. You would then be able to contribute either cash or loans or labor or inventory that total up to equal that same amount. And that you can think through and do different ways. But all of the other points you really don't necessarily have control over. It is based on having gotten this grant in the past, which it doesn't sound like any of you have. So that's great. You guys would all automatically get 5 points just for not having had the grant before. And then these priority points, these 20 other points are kind of the area that's most likely to potentially shift with the new administration and with whoever is kind of reviewing the grants. So these 20 points are directed towards USDA priorities. So I know right now there's a priority for like mid-tier value chains. They usually look at geographic diversity. And so if everybody in New York State got awarded the grants, they would kind of shift some points over to the other states as well. But if you look at that breakdown, these 25 points are only a quarter of the total evaluation. So a lot of it is in your control to really give a really good presentation. And we can definitely help you with mapping out how you would go after these potential points and work on all of these various sections. And then are we ready to move into community data?
I think so. Yeah, I can. Yep. I think this is the last piece, again, like we said, there's always a lot of planning, thinking that can go into writing a grant application, but some of the big pieces that we felt, are worth looking at closely, are worth kind of thinking about preparing in advance. One of these is gathering business and community data. So if we I think what is helpful again is kind of thinking about this in terms of internal data and external data. There's a lot of different ways that you can give evidence of your experience, evidence of the impact that this project will have. It doesn't always have to be, you know, large statistical data sets. It doesn't necessarily have to be like long-term studies or evaluations that have been done. There's lots of ways to quantify your work, show your success. So some examples of internal data and things that you might want to be able to have at your fingertips when you're working on grant applications might include organizational capacity. So you want to show evidence of your organization's business's ability to carry out the project, but this can include things like infrastructure and equipment. We already have all of the equipment that we would need to administer a project like this. We're ready to go. It's just about implementing services at this point. Or if we had this one piece of equipment, it would unlock our ability to increase our production and expand our services. So there's a lot of different ways to kind of frame this work. Financial statements are a big one. So if you have access to your recent profit and loss statements, balance sheets, if you have a current budget, if you're able to project a budget, if you're very new and you don't have a budget yet, but you can show that you've done your due diligence about this is what we think our projections are. If you've had audited reports of any kind that can show fiscal responsibility and operational capacity, or previous fundraising or revenue history. It's not saying that you necessarily need every single one of these things in order to apply for a federal grant. It really depends on a lot of the requirements of the program. But these are things that you might have already in your wheelhouse that you can pull up and say, okay, now how can I adapt this to the program that I need to show my experience? Previous program outcomes, this is another one. It doesn't necessarily always have to be quantifiable, but you can show the results of similar programs that you've done in the past. That's really great anecdotal evidence that you're positioned to do it in the future. Maren mentioned staff qualifications. That's a scoring criteria for this particular grant, and it's a high scoring one. So if you have an organizational chart, if you have a list of your key professional staff and their experience, sometimes that's a paragraph, sometimes that's a resume. It kind of depends, but having some of that, that's stuff that you can be building in the background before you ever apply for a grant so that it's always there. You can always pull it back up. It's just a matter of updating it and getting the latest version. But those are things that you can do to have to be ready for a grant application. And it's kind of evergreen at that point. Strategic plans, mission, and vision statements. If you have any documents like that, and not everyone does, we kind of understand that planning is always the hardest part. But if you have things like that that you've built, that you have available, that also shows that you've got a foundation, you've got a structure. It's just more proof that you're, prepared to take on federal awards. And then external or community data examples. So some of these might be community or target population data. This could be statistical data. This could be demographic data. You might have county data you can point to, city data you can point to about the populations that your funding will serve. I think it's always helpful. It's almost always helpful. It's never going to hurt you to be thinking strategically about the ways that the funding that you're getting from the federal government will help your community or your business beyond just the specific project needs. So if you can kind of think, this is what I need to do this one thing, but by doing this one thing, I'm going to be able to benefit all of these other aspects of the community, of how I'm engaged, of how I'm more connected with civil society, you're going to have a more competitive application. So it's always helpful to kind of think through what that could be. Letters of support or commitment is another good example. So this is another one where maybe you don't always have the hard numbers, but maybe you've got a lot of businesses who are like, we think you're great. We're willing to put on paper that we think you're very capable of this project, of implementing this thing, of kind of receiving this federal award. That's always going to look good. And that's a nice way to use your network, kind of build relationships with one another. And then evidence of demand. If you can show through data that the demand for your project, if there are needs assessments that have been done, community input or surveys that have already previously indicated the gaps or services that are in need that you're positioned to fill through this funding, it's also going to make a really compelling narrative. So again, not saying you need every single one of these things at every single given time in order to apply for a federal award, but it just helps you think about what do you have internally that you can use and leverage already, and then what can you use externally that already exists that doesn't require you to kind of start from scratch, start telling the story from scratch. And then we included in this next, so what we put together, there's dozens of things that are out there. We tried to think about what might be most relevant to this group here if you're trying to apply for a federal award. So we have some links, some surveys, just a few things, Census Bureau, links to things that, again, for community data purposes, if you're ever trying to tell that story, these resources might be useful to you, and just kind of exploring and seeing, can this help improve my grant application? So I think what we can do, I think the next section is writing the grant narrative. So why don't we shift into that? And what I'll say is, before we get started in this, we built a lot of slides because we wanted everyone here to have these resources at their fingertips after this class. So we're going to try to do kind of a quick overview of what this looks like, because we also want to do a writing exercise for you. But if you have questions about the actual act of writing a grant narrative or what this process looks like, put them in the chat. We'll make time for it. We can also follow up with you and, additional conversations, but I'm going to try to just like move through this process so that we can actually get to the point where everyone here gets, 10 or 15 minutes to kind of try it out and practice it a little bit. So, why don't we jump into it? And then if there are additional questions, please throw them in the chat. We'll try to make time for it at the end. So the narrative, this is kind of the core piece of the grant application, which is why we wanted to focus on it today. It's the part of your grant application that's going to outline the project or program. It's going to explain why you need this funding, and it's going to also demonstrate, like we mentioned before, that you are the person, you are the group, you are the organization, the community that has the skills, capacity, and experience needed to implement a project, service, or program. So what we find as a general rule of thumb, this really varies depending on the NOFO, but most narratives tend to be around 10 pages unless there are specific requirements. And a well-crafted narrative is going to have clear, persuasive language, and it's going to align with the funding agency's priorities. So there's a lot of talk, and I agree with this. There's a lot of ways to build language that you can use over and over again across multiple grant applications. But what's helpful is you're always going to have to think about, but this particular application is asking for this specific thing, so let's align it as much as we can. Next slide, please, Maren. So the elements of a grant narrative, this is the part we're going to kind of move through fairly quickly, but just want to make sure you sort of think through, there is a formula to this. It's the art is in kind of the story that you're telling about your project and your program, but the structure is kind of it's the same. So there's typically an introduction. It's around 1 to 2 pages. This is where you're just talking about your organization. You're demonstrating that you're eligible, the qualifications that you have. There's the statement of need, which is where you're talking about what problem you're trying to solve with this grant funding and its potential impact on the community or the business. It explains why this funding is necessary for you to be able to do what you want to do. There's the project description, which is a little bit more detailed. And this is where you start to get into, okay, this is the project. This is how we're going to implement this funding. This is what we're going to use this funding to do. And it's going to include things like your goals and objectives and your planned activities and your project timeline. And then there's the conclusion and sustainability. This is often a chance for you to kind of restate your most compelling key points. Occasionally, there's a question that you can be prepared for of thinking about once this grant funding runs out, are you still positioned to continue this program, continue these services? What will that look like after this funding runs out? But it tends to be kind of a structure that you can really follow and kind of break down into specific pieces. Next slide. And I do see a couple messages, so I just wanted to see. Okay, great. Thank you, Claire. Thank you, Claire, for taking care of the chat for us too. So we'll do this quickly. This is the introduction. We tried to kind of frame this as here are some questions to kind of get you thinking about what you want to write for, what these sections typically include. But this is really setting you up to say what is going to make you a credible applicant. So this is, again, this section typically provides a brief history of the organization, description of past and present operations, goals, mission, kind of where you're at, where you were, where you're at, where you're trying to go, your professional staff and their qualifications, and then information that is relevant to the funding, to the funders, sort of like a positive track record with previous grantors. Have you had award applications in the past? How have you managed that? That's always helpful information to, it's very competitive to be able to say you've had past awards. You don't have to have them to get them, but once you start accumulating them, it builds your credibility toward getting additional funding as well. Statement of need. I think we talked about this one. This one to me feels sometimes like the easiest one to talk about because it's explaining the problem why you're going for this funding in the first place. People are very good at diagnosing the problem and explaining what the impact on the community and the significance of the problem. But it's always helpful to be able to do that with data and statistics. So beyond just saying like, I need this thing, I need this piece of equipment, or, well, I want to make my farm larger. It's a little bit more of like, by doing this thing, I will have this impact. I will be able to provide, this much more amount of, I'll be able to support these food banks, or I will be able to expand the reach of the local farmers market. There's a lot of different ways to be able to say that. That's going to make you more strategic and competitive in what you are doing more broadly. Project description. What will you do with this funding? I think this is one of the harder ones. So describing kind of, you're not necessarily always there. I think I try to say this a lot to folks who are writing grant applications. You're not necessarily there to say, I know all of the solutions and I'm going to fix this and this is how. You're describing, more importantly, your approach to solving the problem. And I think that can be a nuance that often gets missed. You're kind of walking through it and saying, these are the steps that I'm going to take to figure this out. And by doing these things, I think I will be able to solve this problem. So you're going to say, I have goals and objectives. This is my goal. This is my objective. These are how I'm going to implement this and figure it out. And this is when I'm going to do these things. We'll go into that a little bit more, but these are examples that we've left here so you can see this. But a goal is, the difference between a goal and an objective is a goal is a broad statement about the long-term expectation of what you think should happen as a result of your intervention. So, we tried to use this example, the goal would be we want to improve the marketability of organic vegetables on our farm. The objective is the statement describing the results to be achieved and the way that they will be achieved. So how will you support this goal? And so the example is to increase the marketability of organic vegetables on our 5-acre farm. I will increase sales by 10% within 1 year by investing $1,000 in custom packaging. So you can kind of see the difference there. One's broad and big, and one gets very specific, numeric. This is how I'm going to implement this and figure it out. I'm not going to talk about this too much. If you are not familiar with SMART goals and SMART objectives, we kind of broke this out so you could see the difference of specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound, and use that example to explain it. But that's something that if we're working with you to design an application, we can go into more detail about and work with you specifically case by case to see how we get there. But we leave it here as a reference for you so that you have it. Planned activities and project timeline. This is what steps will you take to implement your project and when. We talked about this a little bit, so I won't hover on this slide for too long, but this is one of the harder parts, I think, of a grant application, is really trying to see into the future, put a plan together. This is going to be what it looks like. And then also to describe it step by step, which I find a lot of people have a plan. The plan is not the hard thing. It's taking the plan, breaking it down into tasks, and then describing it in language and written language isn't always the easiest thing. So that's where I struggle with this the most. It's where I see the most struggle, is kind of like, I know what I need to do, but then how do I describe this in a way that's going to translate clearly on the page? And then writing for impact. We'll talk about this quickly as well, but we have, I think, some good practices, some common mistakes that we typically see. So we'll go through this real quickly and then we'll leave room for questions. Then we'll try to do kind of a quick short writing exercise. So good practices that we typically see, we highly encourage. We've talked about them a little bit, but write clearly and concisely. So we avoid jargon. I think that's something that people often, that's a common mistake that we see too. People think because it's a federal award, because it's large and imposing and it's, we have to use the large words to convince them that they should give us funding. And actually that's not the case. The plain language is more effective. It tells your story more clearly. Reviewers are looking for someone who can write simply, describe their project, describe the impact it will have, and then, their conclusion. So I would say this is something that we encourage. Following the directions, we talked about this a little bit at the beginning of the presentation, but according to some USDA handouts that we were researching to put this together, at the USDA, a reviewer might be assigned 10 to 20 proposals at any given time. So they are looking through, they have the evaluation criteria memorized, they have the rules and requirements, memorized. What they're looking for is they're looking for very specific things. They want it to be as easy to read, as easy to understand as possible. So following the directions in the NOFO isn't cheating. It actually sets you up. It makes it easier for everyone involved to just say, okay, they're asking for this thing, I'm answering this thing. They're asking for this thing, I'm answering this thing. It's appreciated. And then focus on quantifiable results where possible. So we've talked about this with the internal data, the external data that's available, but there are all kinds of results that you can use. It could be the number of participants you had at your event. It could be the amount of funding that you've received in the past. It could be the percent change in time or efficiency based on things that you've done. And then if results can't be quantified, which is fine, that happens, it can also just demonstrate how the program or service works, how it's effective. So this could involve things like stories about the number of partnerships that have been led or anecdotes that indicate like an increase in satisfaction based on the interventions that you have participated in. And then common mistakes. This is the one we've talked, I think I mentioned this earlier, but copying and pasting language from other grant applications. It is a very good strategy. It is very smart, very wise. We encourage it to kind of have a lot of things at your fingertips that you can use and reuse for different grant applications. The challenge is you always want to take that second round of review and edit and align that language that you have and adapt it to this specific funding opportunity as well. So a lot of times you see applications come through that were clearly just copied and pasted from other different sources, but it doesn't actually speak to why it's relevant to that funding. And that's where a lot of applications kind of get lost or discarded. And then complicated formatting and structure. Again, reviewers are tired, they're busy, they probably are doing 10 other things on top of reviewing applications. Actually, the simplicity of the narrative is the best strategy. They're looking for, we need this thing, did you speak to this thing? We need this thing, did you speak to this thing? So we encourage simplicity, straightforwardness in all of the grant writing applications, but obviously we know that sometimes that's the hardest thing to do. So those are some tips for writing for impact. And I think we'll pause there. I know we're running into time, but are there any questions that we can help answer just about grant narratives more broadly?
Folks are welcome to unmute or you can put your questions in the chat. And also we can do one more round of Q&A after the writing exercise. Does that sound good?
That sounds fine too. Yeah, I know it's a lot of information too. It takes time to think through. So maybe what we'll do is we'll do the writing exercise and then you can either do the writing or think about the questions and we can discuss both at the end if that's helpful. And I will pass it back to, so I'll just say this too, because I want to be I know we have another presenter tonight as well. So why don't we try to do maybe, can we do a 10-minute writing exercise? Does that work? And then we'll do a quick round of discussion and pass it off.
Yeah, that sounds good. As long as like 7:10 at the very latest for being finished.
Okay. think we can do that. Does that work, Myron?
Yes, I think that sounds great. So for our writing exercise tonight, we are pulling this directly from the value added producer grant application, but we made kind of a broad prompt. So even if you're not interested in applying for that, you can still use this with pretty much any USDA grant will request this type of information somewhere in the narrative. And so today we would like you to spend the next 10 minutes writing about any project you would like to do on your farm. This doesn't have to be anything big. It could be if you're interested in putting up a greenhouse or something, but it could also be something small, like just, getting custom packaging, like in our example, or transitioning to organic, which I guess is kind of big. But whatever scale of project you're currently thinking about, just take some time writing about how this project would expand your markets. This could be geographically, demographically, just the amount you sell in any way, or bring in new customers who are not currently in contact with your farm. And you can also explore how this project would potentially increase revenue for your farm business. And so we'll give you about 10 minutes and then we'll come back and discuss. Bye, Jen. I hope you have a good time at the school concert.
Thank you.
All right, I think we'll probably wrap this up in about 60 seconds or so. So if you want to finish any final thoughts or close out any sentences, we'll pick this up in just a minute.
Okay, everyone, pencils down. And so this was kind of a short taste of what grant writing is like. And for the sake of time, we're going to have to cut our reflection a little bit. But here are a bunch of questions that I think you should be reflecting on yourself as well as you're looking at this type of section for a narrative. I think thinking about, is there more information that you feel that you need? What data or evidence could further support your draft? And where can you find that? I think is really important. Once you start writing, the first time you kind of realize what you need to better prepare it. Does anyone have any like reflections or questions that came up during this exercise that you'd like to share with the group?
Hi, one of the questions that I had was how much information is too much information? Like, how do you find the balance between over explaining versus getting to the point?
Good question. And that is the art. And it's always a little bit hard to know. I think what might be helpful to think about is kind of reverting back to that, like a grant narrative, typically 10 pages, depending on the section that you're kind of working on or writing. Maybe say, okay, what is 1 to 2 pages? What's the most impactful writing that I can say in that amount of time? I tend to take the strategy of just write what I know, get it all out there, and then I just delete or edit or revise until I get it down to its simplest form. But my guess is with federal awards, it's kind of hard to be too informative. So I'd say start more informative and then you can kind of work your way back. Um, I also see a hand. Oh, go ahead, Joe Hogan.
Think that was helpful.
Okay, good. Sorry, we'd want to like look at it. We could give you more specific advice, but start big and then you can always cut back as you get closer to what you're looking for. Um, I also see a hand raised from Diane, I think.
Yeah, one of the things, because I've advised on grants and I've written a number of grants, is that I find myself like if you give your project a title, it's easy to have like you want it to be something like really concise, like Smith Farm, strawberry jam, rather than Smith Farm's expansion into value-added food products via strawberry jam, because you may reference the project name and it starts to get really cumbersome and redundant over time. And you find yourself going, I'm seeing that and hearing that a lot. I probably should stop doing that. The other thing is that you don't need all of that. It's not like an essay in high school where you're just like, I need 5 pages, so I'm going to keep writing until I have 5 pages. I've served as a grant reviewer, and I'm here to tell you that brevity is beautiful.
That's fantastic advice. Everyone should definitely, I am also going to be adopting that. So thank you for the comment. That's 100% true. Um, and in the interest of time, I'll say this, we're here. We have a whole program around this. We have grant writers who are excited to work with you. So we're happy to engage in these conversations as often, as frequently, as much as you'd like. But I will pass it over to Marin to give a little bit of a summary of what that could look like.
Yeah, so like Christy was saying, we're the Federal Funds Grant Writing Assistance Program, and we provide a whole range of services completely for free to organizations across Washington State. And we can do all sorts of things. Like I saw a comment in the chat about needing help looking for grants. That's one of our services we can do. We usually call it an opportunity scan. And if you come to us with a project or an interest, we can help identify federal fund opportunities. And we can also, once we've identified an opportunity you're interested in, we can do a scan to see what the potential requirements would be if you're eligible for it, and kind of do that walking through the reading of the NOFO with you. And we can also do everything when it comes to the universe of writing and developing and reviewing and editing a grant narrative and application as well. And then there's a couple other specific things like we can do. Like if you're working with partners, we can help you facilitate and convene those relationships. And we can also assist with broader project management and really a whole range of things. These are just some of the services we offer. So if any of that sounds interesting to you, if there's something else you are interested in support for related to federal grant applications, please reach out to us. And you can do that by emailing our email address here. It is wafederalgrants@haggertyconsulting.com. And these slides will be shared out, and we'll share the email address with you all as well. So if you're interested in continuing to work with us, if you really liked what you started writing and want to apply for a grant using that, we can get started on that for you, whether it's the value-added producer grant that we started talking about today, or another opportunity, or if you just want help looking for various opportunities, we're here for you. And if you could just include some details about your organization, your farm business, and what you're looking for, we can go through the process of getting you into our program a little bit quicker. And the first step for that would be doing a program intake session, which would be with me and one of our grant writers. And we'll just kind of talk through that, what you're interested in during that session, and figure out how best we could support you. And then from that, we'll develop some recommendations for potential services and put together some next steps. And you'll get assigned a grant writer who will be working directly with you. And we'll go from there and hopefully get you some federal awards. And one other resource from the Department of Commerce that we like to shout out is the Fund Hub Washington. It's a website put up by the Department of Commerce that includes state, local, and federal opportunities related to climate and clean energy. So there's definitely some great stuff out there that's available to farmers, and it's a really, really accessible portal to search for grants. It's definitely a lot easier than grants.gov. So if you're interested in kind of just starting to explore what grants might be out there, if you're just starting to kind of suss out the vibe, I think the Fund Hub is a great place to start. And that's all we for tonight. Does anybody have any more questions or comments? Oh, and feel free to come off mute if you'd like as well.
Right. Well, thank you so much to you both, Christy and Marin. That was a great presentation and really so much helpful information for everyone. So yeah, thank you for taking the time to share all that with us. So we're going to switch gears, and now we have Jensen from Sisterland Farms. And Sisterland Farms is a trans person owned farm in Port Angeles. And Jensen began this back in 2018 with 5 of their siblings. In addition to growing food, Sisterland Farms runs a host of programs, including an agricultural educational program and a local compost pickup program. Jensen studied agriculture at Kansas State University and also the University of Ghana. They've been farming professionally for over a decade and teaching agriculture for almost as long. Sisterland Farms has been the recipient of a few grants, including the WSDA Infrastructure Grant. Jensen has been both a grant writer and reviewer, so they have a lot of wisdom to share with us tonight. So Jensen, I'll let you take it away.
Great. I'm going to share my screen, so if everyone can just give me a moment. Okay, Thanks for the introduction. I realized recently that I've been farming professionally for 14 years, which kind of blew my mind. So this is the earliest photo that I have of myself as a farmer and one of the most recent. There's been a whole world of experience between these two photos, and we're just going to scratch at the surface today. But I did want to say that my history as a farmer actually begins with veterinary medicine. And my first positions as a farmer, I was working in livestock. And I transitioned to vegetable and flower production after an injury. So I sort of have a broad set of experiences, and a lot of what I do today was informed by, unfortunate workplace accidents. Um, but also the education that was received along the way with various mentors and having the freedom during that transition period to interview people in the food sector. At the time, I was on the East Coast in DC, and I was able to traverse the continent and work on lots of different operations before I arrived in Port Angeles, Washington. So my current farm, Sisterland, it's in Port Angeles city limits. Um, we have a CSA operation, and the compost program that was mentioned, it's our county's only kitchen compost pickup program. So we actually operate as a utility. So about half of all of the work we do is utility and service of the county. Um, we try to host public events every month, and I'm going to come back to that a lot. But these are primarily educational. They can also just be community building, and they can be fun. The farm also co-owns the Pine and Eight grocery store. And this is a grocery that will be opening this Saturday, actually, if you are in the area. Um, we stock entirely from Washington State, and we try to build relationships hyper locally. So we primarily are looking for product within our own county, and we want to be on a first name basis with the people who make the food that we vend in the store. So if you are, this is a nice little segue, if you are applying for a value added grant, as a small farmer, please stay in touch and let us know what you've got. I do have a decade of experience with writing agricultural grants. In my history, the grants that I have co-authored or authored have won over $300,000. I've also been a grant reviewer for about 3 years, and I lead grant writing workshops every season on the farm as part of the Clallam Growers Collective, or just independently as Sisterland. Um, I did want to mention that one of the things, or something that I'm going to focus on, is sort of this wide range of grants that are out there for agricultural producers. My grants that I have won as a professional farmer range in size from about $500 all the way to $130,000. Um, Obviously, as you grow, as you accrue or have more land holdings, your needs are going to be a little bit different. So I'm not suggesting that somebody who would be eligible for a $200,000 grant also apply for a micro grant that ought to go to a smaller farmer. But what I am saying is that a lot of what we can talk about today will be pertinent to these small community-based grants as well as larger governmental grants. Um, and the narrative, I think, while a lot of what we just learned is golden, there are some tweaks that I would make to a narrative if you were, in fact, applying for a smaller grant through a small community program or a nonprofit fund. So I am going to approach this as if we are building a support base for our grant proposals, and then we can sort of mine information from that support framework to write more powerfully. I will get into some more technical advice, and I'm always happy to talk at the end about what I think has worked in the past and what doesn't work. So my first piece of advice that I have for you is to collect data whenever possible. And this is a repeat of what you just heard, but I will add to that. We're not just collecting data that is the weights, the yields of certain harvests or trends in your market. I think it's really important to collect as much as you have the capacity for. So climate changes, the names of people who are on your property, pest loads, diseases that you've seen, how much waste you create. All of these are really, really important data points that you can use later. I would also advise you to keep a really detailed resume, but if you're working with a group or if you co-own, I think it's really important to keep an organizational resume. That can be a corporate resume, but basically, you want to say that you've not only worked 5 years in the field, you've worked a collected 20 years. I'm sorry, I don't want to lose my voice. We keep records of visitors, also of our clientele. I'm so sorry, Claire, I'm losing my voice.
It's okay. Take a minute. Totally fine. Yeah, there's definitely been some colds and sicknesses going around in the last like few weeks, last month. So stay healthy, everyone. Try not to get sick.
As part of data collection, I'll ask people who visit the farm if I can have their consent to photograph them or to record their contact information. Um, you can use this obviously to reach out to them later, but I think having sort of a file. I'm so sorry. Can I have 1 minute?
Yeah. Go for
Okay,
it. Yeah, if you want to take a break, Jensen, go for it. We can kind of switch gears.
just one.
Yeah, go for it. Yeah, would anyone like to share what they wrote during the writing exercise? Or if you're not comfortable sharing what you wrote, you could share like some questions or thoughts that came up.
I am super curious how I'm ever going to get like enough words. I know that Diane had mentioned to be concise and that can be a benefit, but also as I'm writing out and practicing this, it's like 2 paragraphs and it's asking for 1 to 2 pages. Like, how does one expand on their thought without being too much?
Yeah, that's a good question. Marin, did you want to try answering that?
Yeah, I mean, I think I can give a little bit of my perspective. Christy's the professional grant writer in the room, but I think one of the biggest things, like Jensen was talking about just now, and like we were talking about, just having data really helps because it will really strengthen your application and it also will like give you a lot more to write about. And so I think, take Jensen's advice and like keep detailed accounts of things related to your project that might not seem super valuable, but I think even if you can say like we reduced the amount of waste on our farm by like this many dumpsterfuls or something, whatever your metric is, I think those things can really add a lot to your word count and also the depth of your application.
Another thing to remember is that there are a lot of grant applications now that have a word limit or a character limit. And you may be applying in an online portal. And so it's really handy to use a word count feature. I know Microsoft Word has it, but a lot of times you'll have the ability to download the application out of the online portal and you can dump it into a word processing document, all of the language, and then you can just fill in the blanks. And then when you go to copy and when you go to actually complete the grant application, you copy and paste, but you check your word count beforehand So if you have an introduction that gives you a 500 word count, that's all you've got to tell your story.
Yeah, totally agree, Diane. That is a really good idea, is to take, the for the example we were looking at today, the value added producer grant, it is one of those that's on an online portal. So taking those questions and putting them in like Google Docs or Word or something so you can see your word count is really good. I would say that for federal grants, word counts aren't as common, or they're often a lot higher than, like Diane, you were talking about, like a lot of those local grants. I used to work at King County on local food stuff, and I reviewed a lot of those regional food system infrastructure grants, and those had really tight word counts. So I think that is one difference with federal funds, is that you often do have a lot more space to write. And so also tailoring it to the type of funding and source of funding you're looking for is really important.
And then I don't have a background in grant writing or technical writing, but I do have a background in creative writing. That's what I got my degree in college a long, long time ago. But I can say, like, anytime you're dealing with, like, you have too few words or too many words, um, dealing with those kinds of issues, like when you're writing the first draft of something, just get it all out on the page. If you're feeling like you have too few words, take some of that pressure off of yourself and pretend that you're writing to a friend or describing this to someone, and pay attention to like how your body feels when you hone in on something that you're really passionate about. Even if it's a piece in the project that you're like especially passionate about, all of a sudden it's going to be a lot easier to write, and you can just kind of like get those words on the page. And whether you need more words, you can expand upon that, or less words, you can kind of like go through and start editing it. But what I've always found any type of writing I'm doing is like taking that pressure off, because nobody has to see that first draft. It can be the worst thing you've ever written. It doesn't matter. It's just about getting those ideas out on the page.
And Claire, this is Brad Brown. I think one of the things that has helped me is to write the last part first, because the last part is what I am most excited about and the goal that I'm headed for. And so all of everything I say from the start should point to that.
Yeah, that's great advice. I like that.
Yeah, and I think one thing I would just add, specifically for like the opportunity we are talking about in the writing exercise we did, that was one part of one section of the narrative section. So that section, if it's only 1 to 2 paragraphs, that's actually like probably a good length, because it is part of that larger 3 to 5 page project description section. So also with a lot of federal grants, they're often super specific in what they're looking for. So like Brad was saying, you could go and find, and Claire was saying, you could go and find the section that you're most excited about and start there, and kind of write to that prompt, and then kind of fill out the other ones with the parts that you maybe don't have as much to say about.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, it's like all about taking those small steps, because like, yeah, when you're approaching a project that big, I think it can feel overwhelming pretty quickly. So breaking it down into steps and finding the part that you're most excited about, that you feel the most relaxed in, I think that's really good advice. It looks like we have another question in the chat. This person asked, does anyone have experience or advice on applying for the Value Added Producer Grant Planning Grant? And that's the grant for feasibility study plus the business plan.
If nobody in the room has experience, I would just reiterate that that's exactly what our program is here for, the Federal Funds Grant Writing Assistance Program. We can advise you this if you're interested. You can definitely shoot us an email at the email I dropped in the chat, and we can have a meeting and talk through, give you advice on the program, or even potentially help review or assist with writing your application.
All right, great. And I just heard from Jensen and they are ready to keep going. So we'll pass it back to them.
Yeah, thanks for affording me a little break. I also I have an assistant here. His name is Benji, and so if I lose my voice again, he's going to pick up the presentation where I leave off.
All right, sounds good. Teamwork.
Okay, so I did want to sort of finish off here. When we have an event on the farm, we always try to provide feedback forms. So opportunities for people to um, express how they feel or give us positive feedback, critical feedback, so on and so forth. You can ask for consent to use that information later. And this becomes really, really handy as you're building out a grant proposal to know what your strengths are and to also know who is most ready and willing to speak to those strengths, particularly if you're looking for letters of support. As a grant reviewer on multiple grants, there have not, that I have reviewed, there hasn't been a limit to how many letters of support you can have as part of your grant proposal. While we may only read 2 or 3 of the letters of support, if we see an application move across our desk that has 16 letters of support, we don't forget that. And many of them will get read. So when folks do visit, when you do have an event, if you are able to have volunteers legally, always try to collect information about their experiences and be willing to sort of lean on that later. I also think I call this switchboard operating, but as you grow, as a small business or as a farmer, I think it's important to connect other people within the field to each other. Those relationships mean that you're going to have an exponentially uh, faster growing community and impact. I think it's critical for us to connect with people in our agrarian communities and then to continue to follow up with them. Um, so if you are working with a particular independent contractor on a task and you recommend them to another farmer, make sure that you follow up, make sure that everybody feels good about that connection, and be that person who's willing to share their resources and share their community with other farmers and other professionals in the field. This is only going to sort of build sort of that well of support, of verbal support that you can draw from later. Um, I've been really fortunate to work with a lot of folks in the food system, from water drillers and millers to people who work in food banks and outreach and roasteries and ranches. And when I connect them, not only am I increasing their community, but I'm also sort of deepening this relationship that I have with someone who works in a different aspect of the shared field of ours. And if I do someday need to write a grant that could draw upon their expertise, there's just nothing like having a farmer elder, in your close circle or having someone whose experiences could better inform your grant application. And oftentimes, at least in my community, we're very, very eager to help each other. We just need to be called on to do so. And this is such a simple way that we can support each other's missions. And yeah, I mean, we're talking about maybe the work of an hour to put together a really strong letter of support or to proofread somebody else's grant proposal. So building those connections and seeing the merit in the experiences that others have that you might not, I think is just going to make you such a powerful writer and community builder. These letters of recommendation, keep them. I always keep all of my letters of recommendation, because I can often call on people to use that again. Sometimes, if folks are speaking to my community building or to my compost operation, that stays pertinent next year. And while not every letter of support is going to be relevant to the specific grant proposal, if it does speak to your qualifications or the likelihood that you can complete a project, it is still an important letter of support. So I do ask for consent when someone writes me an LOS to keep it and to reuse it, but I'll always reach out to them if I do choose to use it again or quote from it. I would also say, in as much as you can, always return the favor. Encourage your peer farmers to apply for grants and then be prepared to write them letters of support or to proof their grants as well. As a grant reviewer, sort of this misconception that got blown apart for me was that there's only a certain a size of the slice of pie that will be given to any one city or community or county, which isn't true. What I have seen happen is when lots of folks from Kitsap or lots of folks from Clallam are applying for grants, it almost draws the review committee's attention. We say, oh, something is happening there. This is a community that is rapidly growing, and it becomes a point of conversation. So I think it's important to encourage other farmers to apply for the same grants that you have to help them, to guide them through the process, and to be on call as they need, to be able to give those words of support that have helped you along as well. I think the general etiquette for asking for these letters is to ask well in advance and then schedule a reminder email. Farmers are very busy. You know this better than anybody. So a nudge about a week before the due date, if you still haven't heard back with an LOS, is always appreciated. When I ask somebody for a letter of support, I will often bring up talking points. This just fortifies my application. If I'm able to give somebody an elevator pitch of what I'm asking for in my grant, then I know I understand my ask perfectly. So this is just one other way that you can exercise and make sure that you're communicating your needs clearly. If you can ask your buddy in a one paragraph email to write you a grant for this project, Project X, then you've distilled it into its essential talking points, and you're going to be able to write more clearly and concisely. Always be transparent. I have been asked to write letters of support before where I wasn't given information that I would have needed to be a convincing writer. So if you are going to ask a peer farmer, make it easy on them, and be very upfront and transparent about what you plan to do and what that budget might look like. And then, like I said before, always ask for consent to keep that letter. On top of all of this, I think it's really important to write thank you notes, and then to keep the letter writers and the people who have proofread your grant or helped you along the way informed about your project. Let them know if you won the funds or if you lost. Make sure that that conversation doesn't just end when they provide you with something. This sounds very general, but it's super important. You need to look for ways to give back as a farmer. Every business is going to have excesses, and as farmers, I think we're sort of trained to think that our excesses are trash. They're compost. So it often goes underappreciated. But I think that the enormous ripple effects that you can have by just giving your time and your energy, they're going to further your impact as a small farmer and independent business, and they're going to sort of strengthen your portfolio, your resume, and these connections that you're building with your peer farmers. All right, this is getting a little bit more technical, but you can, so many people don't understand this, and it's very, very important that you do. You can only be awarded what you ask for. If a grant proposal comes onto my desk and the total that you might have been awarded is $50,000, but you only ask for $15,000. And I'm looking at your grant proposal and I see that the task that you've set for yourself would be so much easier on you if you asked for $25,000 or $30,000. Nothing that I do as a member of a grant review committee is going to allow me to award you more than what you asked for. Even if you have the best grant that I've read that cycle, all that I can do is give you the max of what you asked. So it's critical that you take the time to calculate exactly what you need, weigh out your own inputs and labor. Oftentimes you can't get paid for that labor, so make sure in your budget that you write it as a match. I mean, get technical. I would want to see your shipping. I want to see your taxes. I want to see your mileage. Add all of that in, because if you ask for 30,000, we can always choose to award you 20. We cannot choose to award you 45 generally. In fact, in my history as an applicant, I would say my average is about 88% of the award is generally what's given to me. Very rarely do I get 100% of what I am asked, and only once have I gotten none of what I've asked. Generally, I do get a fraction of what I ask for. So go a little bit high with that in mind. All right, this one's tricky in 2025 with discussions about DEI that sort of started at the beginning of this presentation. But I would, if it's a federal grant, I think you might want to play it a little bit more safe in this. But if it's a Washington state grant, or if it's a local nonprofit, or if it's a community fund, this is where I would encourage you to sort of lean differently, shape your narrative differently. But in general, USDA and federal grants perhaps aside, I would say that you need to volunteer information about yourself. Um, Oftentimes, folks maybe assume that we're able to read into their application things that we can't. We can't assume that you're a minority farmer. We can't assume you're LGBTQ. We cannot assume that you speak English as a second language, or that you are a senior farmer, or that you are a young farmer, unless you tell us those things. And so even though these might be criteria that we're waiting, or that we're looking for, if you don't offer that up, if you're waiting for a bubble to fill in, that bubble might not be there. So if there is an opportunity for you to tell us why you are in need of these funds, and if you trust the source of the award, you trust the committee, make sure that you're volunteering that information in the application, because there might not be an opportunity for you to do so very directly. I would always ask for a proofreader or two, and I want to stress that a proofreader is not just your buddy or your partner, but it is someone who reads often and who writes well. They do not need to write grants necessarily, um, but they should be able to communicate very well, and they'll be able to see the weak points in your grant application. This is a little aside that's out of farm culture, perhaps, but there was an interview in the Paris Review with a published poet who said that on average, he got rejected 19 times per poem that he submitted. So I think when we talk about how often we have to try, and how many times we have to repeat this process of writing a grant and asking for something, just keep that in mind. So you can practice with smaller grants. You can review past grants. You can ask to see copies of your peer farmers' grant proposals. These are all going to not only help you to become a better writer, and make stronger grant requests and grant proposals, but they're also going to sort of give you a thicker skin, I think. They're going to help you to see sort of bigger picture. If you do get rejected, if this doesn't work out this time, that does not mean it's not a worthwhile project. You just haven't found the right fund yet. So oftentimes you just sharpen your edges a little bit and you keep going on. 19 times to be rejected is a lot. I mean, if that's the average in the world of poetry, I hope we don't see that in farm grant proposals, but that's just something to keep in mind. When it comes to your filling out the overall grant application, I would say that something that is difficult as a grant reviewer is when folks don't keep their perspective consistent and their aims consistent. What that conveys to me is that they didn't have an excellent idea of what they were asking for. Perhaps they just felt sort of a desperate moment and they were going after funding without a really cohesive and detailed plan. So make sure that your plan is detailed and cohesive, but then also communicate, use the same voice throughout, and be willing to sort of encapsulate what you're asking for in almost every field. Always bring it back to the goal that you have with this grant proposal, should you be awarded. And when it comes to voice, I think it's essential to be practical. This is a request for money. You do need to have a detailed and well thought out budget, but it's also important to be hopeful. That hopeful voice is what's going to engage folks. Grant committees, when it's a smaller organization, these are often volunteers or peer farmers who are on these committees, or it's folks who are just extremely passionate about that nonprofit project or that community fund. They want to feel like they're going to have a huge impact on very, very awesome projects. So make sure that they feel that in your grant application. Make sure that you feel that your project is very possible and that you're the person who can make it successful. Engage them. And then, of course, be realistic about what you can do with the award and timeline. Because as a grant reviewer, after reading 100 grants, I'm able to sort of spot the proposals that seem sort of pie in the sky or impossible to actually achieve, and they tend to get moved lower down in the stack. Something that I would like to drive home is that my farm and my career, what I'm building here in Port Angeles, it would exist without grant support. But by my reckoning, we'd be about 3 years behind.
And so this is Benji filling in. And so a great way to approach grants and grant writing is to understand the cost of time and the power that grants have to propel you forward. And that's going to result in the most effective proposals as keeping a trajectory in mind, a forward trajectory.
All right. We are happy to take any questions if you have them.
I have a question about reporting. And I mean, you collect out a lot of data. A lot of that's really useful for match, whether you're talking about volunteer hours and or in-kind types of contributions. But how do you figure in the reporting that goes along with your grant applications? Because you get the money, you have to tell people what you did with it.
Yeah, the most rigorous reporting that I had was actually for that $500 grant that I won. It was for the smallest grant that I was awarded. They ended up taking something like 12 or 13 hours of administrative time just to justify it. Whereas, like, I had a WSDA grant that was for about $60,000, where they just wanted scanned in records, photographs, because they use those photographs for their own publicity. Um, but we do try to, like, every receipt, every workday, every contractor, that all gets sort of stored into our drive, into the grant drive. And we're able to pull the narratives and the photos and the license numbers, so on and so forth, as needed. But so far, I haven't actually worked with a grant that required nearly that level of detail so far.
You know, we recently got a rural business development grant, and it has a match component as well as a billing and quarterly reporting. And we got $25,000, and I probably spend 10 hours a quarter on that. So
Yeah, and Diane or
free money
Jen-
isn't free.
Yes, it's a very good point. I'm wondering, I have a question about how can people, when they're going to apply for a grant, um, how can they tell how long the reporting is going to be? Like Jensen, were there signs that that smaller grant you got that was going to be such a massive time suck to do all the reporting on that grant? Are there ways to tell?
Oh, of course not. Of course not. It's a total surprise. I would never have applied for it if I would have known. It doesn't make sense. Um, this is yet again why I think talking with peer farmers and building those relationships is so key. Because I now know a half dozen farmers in the state who have won this WSDA grant. And we, as a group, would be so willing to talk about our experiences with other applicants. This $500 grant that we were awarded, this was the first and last time that this grant was offered. There was nobody, there were no elder farmers or former winners that I could talk to about that grant process. But I do think that engaging with your community and seeing, what's your experience with the TILT grant, with WSDA, with USDA, that's going to help you determine if it's actually worth your time in the administrative workload that you will have should you win. Because 12 hours for a $500 grant is
Yeah, that's painful. All right. Do we have any other questions?
I have a question. When looking at putting together the grant proposal and factoring in a budget, is it wise to include indirect cost in the proposal? Is that something is there like a template or something to build that out to include indirect costs? Because I believe just from working in post award, that is something that funding agencies are um, able to include in their requirements. That's a part of like the uniform guidance at this point. So I was wondering if there was insight on how to navigate budgeting for indirect costs.
As a grant reviewer, I would want to see all associated costs. That does not mean that what you're asking for is one of those line items. So I think if somebody presented me with a budget where I saw not only exactly what they were asking for, but what they were going to be contributing themselves and costs that were shared between the two, between the grantor and the grantee. That just shows me exactly what level of pains you're willing to take for this grant application and that you're so much more likely to see this through to fruition. So the more transparency that you can offer in your application without overburdening it, the better. And when it comes to the actual budget requirement for a grant proposal, I have not actually, in my history as a grant reviewer, from a farmer, seen a budget that was too detailed.
That's
Thank
great.
you. I appreciate that.
All right. Any other questions?
So Jensen, I appreciate your transparency, and I think your model of your farm is a template for any underserved, underrepresented, and traditionally marginalized community and farm worker, farm owner, land steward. And so I want you to, I really appreciate that. I know that we're in a climate that's very different than we were even 6 months ago with regard to grant applications. Um, how are you navigating language around anti-bias and equity in your applications now?
That's such a good question. And so, for those of you who aren't super familiar with Sisterland, we're working towards being an employee-owned farm. Our entire crew is queer. Uh, the store that we are opening, we're half owners. So we're half owned by a queer farm crew who all shares voting power in that half ownership. The store applied for a USDA grant to build out a kitchen. And something that made that application so strong was that we were in a food desert, that we were a mixed ownership group of artisans and farmers, the majority of which were queer, and almost all of whom were women or femmes. And that was right before the election. So we're now in this interesting climate, even as an entity, as a business, where I almost feel guilty or responsible if that grant proposal flops, because so much of what we had written was rooted in sort of the rarity of our collective as an ownership group. So now that's why I'm hesitant to tell folks to volunteer this information and to volunteer that level of transparency for federal grants. Washington, I think, is a little bit different. Your county and city and region are even more so. But I would be hesitant. Um, I appreciate everything that you said, by the way, and it means the world to me. I wish that I had something more concrete to tell folks, but most of my grant reviewing history has happened within the state of Washington, and the vibes, if you don't mind my saying so, are very different.
Jensen, Brad Brown, thank you for your time. It's been great. What's the name of the store again? And do you take online orders?
The store is called Pine and Eight, um, which is also its address. It's on Pine Street and 8th Street in Port Angeles. We will have online retail, but we're not there yet. We've got to open the physical doors first. And thank you. Thank you so much, Brad.
Jensen, can you tell us, you're having your grand opening on Saturday? Can you give us a little bit more information about that?
Yeah, so like I said, it's half owned by farmers, half by artisans and craftsmen. Um, Basically, as a farmer in rural Washington, I realized that there's this lack, this need between being a farmer's market retailer and being a wholesaler. And it's really, really hard to bridge that. I interviewed a lot of small farmers who rely on local farmers markets. They love the local farmers markets, and we have nothing against local farmers markets, but it is incredibly difficult to pay yourself if your retail is limited to one day of the week when the weather is nice. Um, and yet, there's no part of vending direct farmer to consumer that prepares you for the work of selling commercially or wholesaling. So we started the grocery store to be that bridge. So we're a very, very small grocery store. We're smaller than like your average corner store. But we have an educational component to what we're doing. So we're taking on the burden of educating the public about what's seasonal and about what real food looks like and about what they can actually expect from local farmers. And we're trying to use some of the funds, that the revenue that we bring in, to educate small business owners. So before we've opened, even, we've had already a tax clinic where we've worked with small farmers to help them initiate bookkeeping and actually start submitting and recording their taxes. And and that's exactly the sort of thing that I would have benefited from in a huge way back in 2017 or 2018. And we're trying to make it abundantly available. So we're not only a source for small farmers who need to retail to the larger community, we're also trying to be sort of your friend as you grow and you take on new experimental avenues to retail. But from a consumer perspective, we're just trying to have lots of really good local food and on days where everything else is closed in Port Angeles.
All right, thank you for sharing that. That's such a great business model. Um, yeah, you're adding so much value to the community. And also one last question. Who is the dog that was in so many of the slides and is your profile picture?
It was so embarrassing because my dog is very, very old and he wheezes and coughs a lot. So a lot of what you guys heard was not me. It was actually my dog. I don't know if you'll believe me or not, but that is Sounder. And I have had him for 12 years. He's about to turn 14. He's enormous. He's a big 80-pound hound dog. And he lived with me when I was farming and working in Washington, D.C. And he's been to, I think, every state in the union with me except for Vermont. So he's my longtime buddy. He's also our integrated pest management specialist.
Oh, that's great. He's very sweet. Looks like a good dog. All right. Well, did we have any other questions, dog or grant related for Jensen or anyone else? All right. Well, we will close out the class with that. And once again, thank you so much, Jensen, Christy, Marin. Thank you for sharing your knowledge and wisdom. And just thank you to all the participants for being here tonight, for taking the time out of your busy evening. And yeah, I'll be sending out some more information, including a survey. If you could please fill that out, it's always greatly appreciated. It really helps us hone in on what kind of programming farmers want and need for their businesses, for their lives, and it really helps us improve the programming. All right. Well, thank you, everyone, and I hope you all have a great rest of your evening.
Thank you, Claire. This was great.
Thank you.
Goodbye, everyone. It was so nice to meet you. Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for being here.
Yep. Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Good night.